Greetings to all and best wishes for this season. As this year comes to a close, I would just want to express my gratitude to everyone who has followed the archives. Your attention and support make preserving and sharing these records possible, and I am thankful for the time you spend exploring the histories and speculations of the Warhammer 40k universe with me. Appreciate you all. Have a good one. Data recovered from fragmented expedition logs, damage pit captures, and long-delayed survey transmissions forms the earliest surviving record of the world that would later be classified under restricted Scholastica review. These materials originate from disparate eras and agencies, some predating full Imperial compliance, others compiled retrospectively after the planet's destruction. Many of these records were never intended to form a cohesive narrative. They exist instead as procedural observations, logistical notes, and marginal annotations made by explorers, remembrancers, and compliance auditors tasked with cataloguing a newly encountered human civilization at the far edge of Imperial reach. Initial references describe a luminous world of unusual clarity, observed from high anchor orbit. Atmospheric readings suggested a stable climate, minimal industrial pollution, and a planetary albedo inconsistent with typical frontier settlements. Long-range augurs recorded vast continental landmasses broken by inland seas and shallow oceans, with no evidence of hive-scale urbanization. Instead, surface scans detected evenly distributed population centers, each separated by significant tracts of undeveloped terrain. The planet's electromagnetic profile was calm, with low levels of background interference, allowing pict feeds to transmit with uncommon fidelity. Eyewitness reports compiled during early survey landings speak of cities constructed in deliberate harmony with the surrounding landscape. Structures rose in smooth geometric tiers, often integrated directly into natural stone formations. There was a conspicuous absence of heavy fortifications or void shield arrays, a detail that raised early concern among Imperial compliance officials accustomed to frontier worlds hardened by Xenos predation or internal conflict. Despite this, no signs of recent warfare or large-scale civil unrest were detected. Population estimates derived from orbital census sweeps suggested several 100 million inhabitants, a figure considered moderate by Imperial standards, but notable for its apparent stability. Growth projections showed minimal fluctuation across centuries of reconstructed data, implying strict population regulation or cultural factors that discouraged unchecked expansion. Genetic sampling conducted under the auspices of routine compliance assessment confirmed baseline human physiology, with minor adaptive markers consistent with long-term habitation on a high-radiance world. Cultural annotations from remembrancer accounts emphasize the population's high degree of literacy and an unusual reverence for learning. Numerous pic captures focused not on manufactoria or agri-complexes, but on vast libraries, observatories, and academies. These institutions dominated urban skylines, often occupying the highest elevations within each city. The emphasis placed on scholarly pursuits was sufficiently pronounced that early administratum observers flagged the planet for additional ideological review. Astropathic transcripts recovered from the period describe a persistent background resonance surrounding the world. While not initially classified as anomalous, several sanctioned psychers reported heightened sensory clarity while in orbit, alongside vivid dream states during translation rest periods. These accounts were noted but not acted upon, as similar effects had been recorded near other compliant worlds without incident. One recurring reference across multiple independent sources is the planet's unusual light. Observers consistently describe the sky as possessing a sharp, almost crystalline brightness during daylight hours, with shadows rendered in stark relief. At night, celestial bodies appeared unusually close, their reflected light sufficient to illuminate urban centres without artificial assistance. Spectrographic analysis later confirmed elevated stellar radiation, filtered through a dense but stable atmosphere, creating conditions favourable to both human habitation and optical clarity. Despite the wealth of data collected, early documentation remains marked by restraint. Survey teams operated under standard protocols, recording without interpretation, observing without judgment. There is little in these initial records to suggest the degree of attention the world would later command within Imperial history. At this stage, it was catalogued as a compliant human-inhabited planet of cultural interest, notable primarily for its scholarly bent and environmental stability. The earliest surviving compilations conclude their introductory summaries with a standardized designation entered into multiple archival systems simultaneously, marking the world's formal inclusion within Imperial records under a single enduring name, the planet Prospero. Prospero was located within the segmentum solar, positioned along relatively stable warp routes that facilitated consistent contact with the wider Imperium. Its primary star was a white-yellow luminary of moderate size, emitting higher than average levels of radiant energy without the instability associated with more volatile stellar classifications. This contributed to the planet's distinctive atmospheric brilliance and supported a diverse but carefully balanced biosphere. The dominant landmasses were arranged around a broad equatorial ocean, with continents extending toward the polar regions in irregular arcs. Mountain ranges were common, often rising abruptly from surrounding plains, their peaks frequently incorporated into urban construction. These elevations served both symbolic and practical purposes, offering natural foundations for major population centres while reinforcing the cultural association between height and enlightenment present within Prospero's dominant philosophies. The planet's cities were neither densely packed nor widely dispersed. Each functioned as a semi-autonomous centre of learning and governance, linked to others by maintained transit routes and regular communication exchanges. There is no evidence of planetary-scale conflict during the height of Prospero's development. Instead, administrative coherence appears to have been maintained through shared ideology and mutual dependence on scholarly exchange. Recovered demographic analyses indicate that Prospero's population was remarkably homogeneous in terms of cultural practice, despite geographic separation. Linguistic drift was minimal, suggesting either centralized educational standards or long-standing traditions of intercity travel and communication. Artistic expression, where documented favored symmetry, abstraction, and mathematical precision over representational forms. Technological assessment places Prospero at a level broadly consistent with mid-tier Imperial worlds, though with notable specialization. Energy production relied on a combination of solar capture arrays and geothermal extraction, minimizing environmental disruption. Manufacturing capabilities were sufficient to support local needs, but lacked the mass industrial output typical of forge-aligned planets. This absence of heavy industry was not due to technological deficiency, but deliberate limitation. One of the most frequently cited features in survey notes is the planet's silence. Ambient sound levels within cities were consistently recorded as low, with architectural designs that dampened echoes and reduced mechanical noise. Combined with the clear atmosphere and measured pace of daily activity, this contributed to an environment described by multiple observers as contemplative, if not austere. The ruling structures of Prospero prior to Imperial integration remain partially obscured, though surviving records suggest governance by councils composed of senior scholars and administrators. Authority was derived from demonstrated knowledge and experience rather than hereditary succession. This system proved compatible with early Imperial oversight, easing the process of compliance. It is important to note that none of the surviving Chapter 1 sources record overt resistance to Imperial contact. Compliance appears to have been achieved through negotiation and cultural accommodation rather than military action. This absence of conflict would later be cited as evidence of Prospero's cooperative disposition, though subsequent events would complicate such interpretations. By the end of this initial phase of documentation, Prospero existed within Imperial awareness as a stable, enlightened world. Its people were regarded as disciplined, intellectually inclined, and broadly loyal. There is no indication in these early accounts of the catastrophe that would eventually befall the planet, nor of the role it would play in shaping the fate of entire legions. At this point in the record, Prospero remains intact, luminous, and unremarkable in the most dangerous sense of the word. Prospero's natural environment was shaped by a convergence of geological stability and stellar influence that produced conditions rarely encountered among settled Imperial worlds. Geological surveys reconstructed from pre-destruction data indicate a planetary crust of unusual uniformity, with low tectonic volatility across most continental plates. Seismic activity was present, but mild, occurring primarily along deep fault systems far from major population centres. This stability allowed surface features to persist for extended geological periods, contributing to the planet's long-standing habitability and predictable environmental patterns. Mountain ranges formed some of the most defining geographic features of Prospero. These ranges were typically composed of dense metamorphic stone, resistant to erosion despite constant exposure to wind and solar radiation. Many rose sharply from surrounding plains rather than gradually, creating abrupt transitions between lowlands and high elevations. Valleys between these ranges often contained freshwater lakes fed by glacial melt and subterranean aquifers. These water sources were consistently clean, with low mineral contamination, making extensive purification infrastructure unnecessary. The planet's continents were separated by shallow oceans rather than deep abyssal basins. These seas moderated global temperatures and supported slow, stable weather cycles. Tidal forces were gentle, influenced by a small number of natural satellites whose orbits remained consistent over recorded millennia. Coastal regions experienced limited storm activity compared to equivalent zones on other Imperial worlds, further reinforcing Prospero's reputation for environmental calm. Atmospheric analysis revealed a dense but balanced composition, rich in oxygen and trace elements that enhanced light diffusion without impeding respiration. This contributed to the planet's characteristic clarity and the sharp visibility noted in early survey logs. Sound propagated cleanly but attenuated quickly, an effect partially attributed to atmospheric density and partially to the mineral composition of the terrain, which absorbed vibration efficiently. Meteorological records describe a climate defined by long, predictable seasonal cycles. Temperature variation across the year was moderate, with no extreme polar freeze or equatorial heat. Precipitation occurred primarily as light rainfall or fine mist rather than violent storms. These patterns supported agriculture without requiring extensive environmental modification, allowing cultivation to coexist closely with natural ecosystems. Vegetation on Prospero reflected the planet's emphasis on balance rather than abundance. Native flora tended towards slow-growing, long-lived species with deep root systems and high tolerance for solar radiation. Forested regions were composed of tall, narrow-trunked trees with pale bark and dense upward-reaching canopies. Leaves were often narrow and reflective, reducing heat absorption while maximizing photosynthetic efficiency. Seasonal leaf loss was minimal, resulting in landscapes that changed gradually rather than dramatically. Grassland biomes were widespread across continental interiors. These plains supported resilient ground cover plants capable of retaining moisture during extended dry periods. The coloration of these grasses ranged from muted greens to silver-blue hues, a trait linked to microscopic surface structures that reflected excess light. Agricultural use of these regions was selective, with large tracts deliberately left uncultivated to preserve ecological equilibrium. Aquatic plant life within Prospero's lakes and coastal seas was similarly restrained. Algae blooms were rare, controlled by both nutrient scarcity and native filtering organisms. Reeds and submerged plants grew in organized clusters rather than dense mats, leaving waterways largely unobstructed. This contributed to the clarity of inland waters frequently remarked upon in remembrancer accounts. Faunal life on Prospero was limited in scale and aggression. Native animal species were predominantly herbivorous or omnivorous, with few apex predators identified. Larger fauna tended toward lean body structures and slow metabolic rates, conserving energy under consistent environmental conditions. Many species displayed heightened sensory perception, particularly visual acuity, adapted to the planet's intense ambient light. Avian analogues were among the most commonly documented animals. These creatures possessed broad wingspans relative to body mass, allowing sustained gliding across mountain updrafts. Plumage coloration often mirrored the muted tones of local vegetation, providing camouflage without reliance on rapid movement. Their calls, where recorded, were low frequency and infrequent, contributing little to ambient noise levels. Terrestrial mammals, where present, occupied narrow ecological niches. Burrowing species favoured mineral-rich soils near mountain bases, while grazing animals remained confined to specific plains rather than migrating across continents. This lack of large-scale migration further stabilised ecosystems, reducing the cascading disruptions seen on more dynamic worlds. Predatory species existed but were few and highly specialised. Most relied on ambush tactics rather than pursuit, with limited population numbers that prevented overpredation. There is no evidence of large carnivorous megafauna comparable to those found on death worlds or feral planets. As a result, human settlements faced minimal threat from native wildlife, reducing the need for defensive adaptation. Insect life was abundant but unobtrusive. Pollinating species played a crucial role in maintaining plant reproduction, while detritivores accelerated natural recycling processes. Swarm behavior was rare, and no species posed a significant hazard to human habitation. This absence of aggressive insect populations further contributed to Prospero's overall environmental serenity. One recurring observation across multiple survey teams is the planet's sensory consistency. Light, sound, temperature, and even scent varied within narrow parameters across vast distances. Travelers reported minimal acclimatization fatigue when moving between regions, a phenomenon attributed to the uniformity of atmospheric and ecological conditions. This consistency reinforced the impression of Prospero as a world deliberately shaped, though no evidence suggests artificial environmental control on a planetary scale. Geological sampling identified deposits of common minerals sufficient to support limited industry, including iron, copper, and silicate compounds. However, rare or exotic materials were scarce. The planet lacked significant promethium reserves, precious metals, or volatile compounds. This scarcity discouraged large-scale extraction and aligned with Prospero's restrained technological development. Volcanic activity was confined to isolated regions, most of which were uninhabited. These zones contributed geothermal energy and enriched surrounding soils without posing significant risk. Volcanic emissions were low in toxicity, further supporting atmospheric stability. Weather phenomena that might be classified as extreme by Imperial standards were virtually non-existent. Electrical storms occurred infrequently and with limited intensity. Tornadic systems were absent from recorded history. Snowfall was rare and light, confined to high elevations and polar regions. This predictability allowed urban planning and architectural design to prioritize openness over fortification against environmental hazards. The cumulative effect of these factors was an environment that demanded little adaptation from its inhabitants. Human physiology operated comfortably within natural parameters, and daily life unfolded without constant negotiation with hostile surroundings. For Imperial observers accustomed to worlds defined by excess or deprivation, Prospero's environment appeared almost curated. This balance, however, also resulted in ecological fragility. Modelling conducted post hoc suggests that Prospero's ecosystems were finely tuned, with limited redundancy. Significant disruption, whether climatic or geological, would likely cascade rapidly through interconnected systems. At the time, this vulnerability was not considered a liability. Instead, the planet's stability was interpreted as evidence of long-term equilibrium. By the conclusion of environmental assessment, Prospero was classified as a world of exceptional habitability, marked by environmental harmony and low resource exploitation potential. Its geography, flora, fauna, and climate reinforced the perception established in earlier records. A planet defined not by abundance or scarcity, but by restraint. This natural restraint would mirror the cultural and intellectual discipline of its inhabitants, setting the stage for events yet to unfold. The historical record of Prospero transitions from environmental assessment to strategic relevance with unusual speed. Once the planet's compliance was formalized, subsequent documentation increasingly focused on its role as the primary seat of the 15th Legion, later known as the Thousand Suns. This shift in emphasis marks the beginning of Prospero's transformation from a culturally distinct but stable world into a focal point of Imperial concern. Following the reunification of the 15th Legion with its Primarch, Magnus, Prospero became the Legion's adopted homeworld rather than its place of origin. Records indicate that this decision was driven by compatibility rather than necessity. The planet's stable climate, intellectual culture, and absence of industrial congestion aligned with the Legion's operational and scholarly preferences. Large-scale Legion infrastructure was established with minimal environmental disruption, expanding existing cities rather than replacing them. Imperial compliance reports from this period describe a notable increase in scholastic output. Libraries expanded rapidly, data repositories multiplied, and previously local academies were elevated to planetary institutions. Civilian and Legion scholarly activity became deeply integrated. While this arrangement was initially praised as a model of cooperation between Imperial forces and a compliant population, later annotations reveal growing unease within certain branches of the administratum. One of the earliest points of concern appears in correspondence related to psychic regulation. Prospero had long tolerated, and in some cases celebrated, the study of psychic phenomena. Under the stewardship of the 15th Legion, this tolerance expanded into structured research. Sanctioned psychers were trained openly, and the boundaries between academic inquiry and warp-adjacent experimentation became increasingly indistinct. Although no immediate violations of Imperial law were recorded at this stage, the accumulation of marginal notes suggests that oversight bodies were monitoring the situation closely. The escalation from observation to intervention is most clearly traced through documentation surrounding the Council of Nicaea. While Prospero itself was not the site of the council, its practices were central to the proceedings. Surviving transcripts and secondary summaries consistently reference the 15th Legion's methodologies as primary examples in debates over the use of psychic abilities within the Legion's Astartes. Following the Council's ruling, which imposed strict limitations on psychic activity among the Space Marine legions, Prospero entered a period of constrained compliance. Official records state that Magnus accepted the verdict and ordered his legion to curtail sanctioned psychic practices. However, internal communications recovered after the planet's destruction suggest that enforcement was uneven. Scholarly work continued, albeit with increased discretion and compartmentalization. The next major inflection point occurs during the opening stages of the Horus Heresy. Fragmentary astropathic records confirm that Magnus attempted to warn the Emperor of Horus's betrayal through direct psychic projection. This act, widely documented in Imperial sources, resulted in catastrophic damage to the Imperial Webway project. While the immediate consequences were centered on Terra, the political and military repercussions would soon converge on Prospero. Imperial response protocols activated in the aftermath of this event are complex and in some cases contradictory. Orders transmitted to the 6th Legion, the Space Wolves, initially framed the mission as one of apprehension rather than annihilation. However, subsequent revisions and clarifications altered the operational scope. The precise chain of command remains disputed among historians, but the outcome is well documented. The arrival of the Space Wolves fleet in the Prospero system marked the beginning of the planet's final phase. Orbital picked feeds recorded extensive fleet deployment and rapid escalation, from negotiation attempts to full-scale assault. Defensive measures on Prospero were limited. Void shields existed primarily to protect civilian centers from environmental hazards, rather than sustained military bombardment. They proved insufficient against a Legion-strength invasion. Ground engagement reports describe widespread devastation concentrated around major cities, particularly the planet of the sorcerers, Tizca. Architectural features once noted for their elegance and restraint were rapidly reduced to rubble. Libraries, academies, and data vaults suffered catastrophic losses. While some repositories were deliberately targeted, others were destroyed incidentally as collateral damage during urban combat. Civilian casualties were extensive. Population figures reconstructed from post-action assessments indicate losses numbering in the hundreds of millions. Evacuation efforts were minimal and largely ineffective. The speed and ferocity of the assault overwhelmed existing civil defense structures, which had never been designed to withstand Legion-scale warfare. Environmental consequences followed swiftly. Orbital bombardment destabilized tectonic fault lines, previously considered dormant. Fires spread unchecked across urban and agricultural regions. Atmospheric particulates increased dramatically, reducing the clarity that had once defined the planet. Weather patterns, formerly stable, entered a phase of violent unpredictability as thermal balances collapsed. The culmination of these events is recorded as a planet-wide catastrophe. Large sections of Prospero's surface were rendered uninhabitable within a matter of days. Surviving populations, both civilian and Legion-affiliated, were either evacuated under extreme conditions or left stranded amid the ruins. By the conclusion of the Space Wolves' withdrawal, Prospero no longer functioned as a viable Imperial world. Subsequent administratum entries reclassified Prospero under restricted status. Long-term surveys were deemed impractical due to residual warp anomalies and unstable environmental conditions. Later reconnaissance missions, where attempted, reported widespread desolation. Once thriving cities existed only as fractured remnants, partially buried beneath ash and debris. The planet's fate was not solely physical. Prospero's destruction marked the effective end of its cultural and intellectual ecosystem. Knowledge accumulated over millennia was lost or scattered, preserved only in fragments carried away by survivors or captured during the assault. The integration between civilian scholarship and Legion research, once seen as a strength, was retroactively cited as a vulnerability. In the centuries following its destruction, Prospero appeared in Imperial records primarily as a case study. References emphasized cautionary themes, the dangers of unchecked intellectual autonomy, the risks inherent in psychic exploration, and the consequences of misaligned loyalty during periods of galactic instability. These interpretations often varied depending on the authoring institution, but the underlying conclusion remained consistent. By the end of the heresy, Prospero was effectively absent from navigational charts as an active destination. Its name persisted not as a location of strategic value, but as a symbol embedded within Legion histories and doctrinal warnings. The planet itself remained, physically present but functionally dead, its once balanced environment irreversibly broken. In final accounting, Prospero's destruction was not the result of environmental failure, nor of external invasion by non-Imperial forces. It was the consequence of Imperial action enacted upon an Imperial world. The records do not assign moral judgment. They document sequence, cause, and outcome. A stable planet, elevated for its compatibility, was eradicated through the same mechanisms that had once brought it into compliance. With this, Chapter 1 concludes its examination of Prospero as a place rather than a symbol. What remains in subsequent archives is no longer a living world, but an absence defined by data loss, residual anomalies, and historical weight. The luminous planet described in early survey logs does not reappear. In its place stands a scar, preserved only in records and memory. With the physical destruction of Prospero complete, responsibility for interpreting, categorizing, and containing its legacy passed from military command structures to the bureaucratic and technocratic organs of the Imperium. The earliest Adeptus Administratum and Adeptus Mechanicus records concerning Prospero following its fall reflect a marked shift in tone from observational reporting to procedural containment. The planet was no longer treated as an active world, but as a resolved variable requiring archival stabilization. Administratum impressions were shaped primarily by loss management. Census data, tithe records, and compliance registries required immediate reconciliation. Entire population blocks were removed from ledgers in a single cycle, replaced by mortality estimates and displacement annotations. These figures were not presented as narrative accounts, but as numerical corrections, often accompanied by margin notes indicating acceptable variance due to combat conditions. The absence of surviving local governance structures simplified administrative closure, even as it complicated historical accuracy. Initial administratum memoranda emphasized the unprecedented scale of civilian data loss. Educational registries, property deeds, scholastic certifications, and civic genealogies were presumed destroyed unless independently verified elsewhere in the Imperium. Recovery efforts focused narrowly on identifying displaced skilled personnel deemed useful to other compliant worlds. Cultural preservation was not listed as a priority category. Knowledge was valued only insofar as it could be reassigned. The procedural framework applied to Prospero followed established post-compliance annihilation protocols. A primary archival node was designated within segmentum solar records, consolidating all surviving documentation under restricted access classifications. Duplicate records were purged where inconsistencies appeared, favouring later, officially sanctioned accounts over contemporaneous civilian or remembrancer material. This process resulted in a streamlined but incomplete historical record. Adeptus Mechanicus impressions differed in emphasis but not in restraint. For the Mechanicum, Prospero represented a failed but instructive dataset. Tech priests assigned to assess the planet's remains approached the task through Auspex analysis, material sampling, and energy residue mapping rather than cultural inquiry. Their reports focused on infrastructure survivability, data integrity, and anomalous readings rather than human cost. Early Mechanicus survey vessels conducted limited orbital passes once hostilities had concluded. Surface access was restricted to controlled landings, often unmanned or performed by servitor teams. These missions prioritized the recovery of intact cogitator cores, power distribution nodes, and any machinery that predated Legion occupation. Findings were catalogued according to Martian classification schemas, isolating technological artifacts from their original context. One recurring observation in Mechanicus documentation concerns the atypical integration of technology within Prospero's urban fabric. Power systems, climate regulators, and data conduits had been embedded with minimal redundancy, reflecting confidence in long-term stability rather than resilience under stress. While efficient, this design philosophy contributed to the rapid systemic collapse observed during the assault. The Mechanicus noted this as a cautionary example of optimization without contingency. Procedurally, all recovered technological materials underwent immediate sanctification review. Devices exhibiting warp-adjacent residues were flagged for quarantine or destruction, regardless of apparent function. Several reports reference cogitator arrays displaying data corruption inconsistent with physical damage alone. These anomalies were recorded without speculation, though access to detailed diagnostics was restricted to senior magi. Administratum clerks working in parallel were tasked with reclassifying Prospero's strategic designation. Once listed as a compliant scholastic world of moderate value, it was re-entered as a restricted ruin world with no tithe obligation and no projected reclamation timeline. Navigational advisories were issued to reroute civilian and commercial traffic away from the system, citing instability and lack of economic incentive. Internal correspondence reveals that neither the Administratum nor the Mechanicus advocated for immediate reconstruction. Resource allocation models consistently ranked Prospero below marginal forge worlds and agri-planets, requiring reinforcement. The absence of rare materials, combined with lingering anomalies, rendered the planet inefficient by Imperial standards. Its prior intellectual output did not factor into these calculations. Documentation procedures placed heavy emphasis on causality framing. Official summaries consistently presented the planet's destruction as an outcome of Legion-level non-compliance, rather than administrative or command failure. Language was standardized to avoid ambiguity, employing phrases that emphasized inevitability and procedural correctness. This linguistic uniformity would later influence all secondary references to Prospero across Imperial archives. Mechanicus marginalia preserved within restricted data vaults hint at unresolved analytical interest. Several magi noted that Prospero's technological simplicity masked unusually high data throughput efficiency prior to its fall. Models attempting to replicate this balance on Forge worlds produced inconsistent results. These observations were logged but not pursued, lacking immediate application. By the end of the initial documentation phase, Prospero existed within Administratum and Mechanicus records as a closed case. Its files were complete, its status finalized, and its relevance confined to reference citations. The process achieved bureaucratic resolution, but at the cost of contextual depth. In this form, Prospero became manageable. Reduced to classifications, figures, and sanitized summaries, it posed no further administrative burden. What had once been a living world of measured balance was now an archival artifact, stabilized through omission and procedural certainty. This perspective would define all subsequent non-inquisitorial treatment of the planet's remains. Following the completion of the initial administrative closure, Prospero remained subject to intermittent review by Adeptus Mechanicus survey divisions tasked with long-term geological and analytical assessment. These efforts were not motivated by intent to reclaim the planet, but by procedural obligation to verify that its classification as a non-viable world remained accurate. As such, analysis was conducted remotely where possible, supplemented by limited surface sampling under controlled conditions. Geological findings confirmed earlier assessments of Prospero's structural stability prior to its destruction. The planet's crust exhibited unusually consistent density across continental plates, with fewer fault intersections than expected for a world of its size and age. This homogeneity had previously contributed to minimal seismic activity. Post-destruction scans, however, revealed that orbital bombardment and sustained surface impacts had compromised several deep fault systems simultaneously, inducing stress propagation across regions previously considered geologically isolated. Mechanicus analytics determined that this cascading destabilization was not a natural inevitability, but a consequence of synchronized high-energy strikes. The planet's former stability had depended on equilibrium rather than redundancy. Once disrupted at multiple critical points, the crust failed to redistribute stress efficiently. This resulted in secondary quakes, subsurface collapses, and mantle disturbances that continued long after active hostilities ceased. Mineralogical surveys reaffirmed the scarcity of rare strategic resources. Prospero possessed modest deposits of iron, copper, and crystalline silicates, suitable for basic construction and data lattice fabrication. Trace amounts of precious metals were identified, but in concentrations insufficient to justify extraction. Notably absent were significant promethium reserves, archaeotech strata, or high-yield isotopic compounds favoured by Forge world exploitation. Despite this, certain anomalies attracted continued Mechanicus attention. Deep-core scans detected layered crystalline formations beneath several former urban centres, particularly beneath the ruins of Tizca. These formations exhibited lattice structures capable of unusually efficient data conduction and energy resonance. While similar materials existed elsewhere in the Imperium, their natural occurrence in such configurations was uncommon. Recovery attempts were deemed impractical due to structural instability and residual contamination. Analytical models suggested that these subsurface formations may have contributed indirectly to Prospero's historical role as a centre of intellectual and psychic activity. The Mechanicus stopped short of asserting causation, instead documenting correlation without hypothesis. All related data was sealed under restricted classification pending inquisitorial review, limiting further technical inquiry. From a strategic standpoint, Prospero's location had once been considered advantageous. Positioned along stable warp routes with predictable translation conditions, the system facilitated reliable travel and communication. Following the planet's destruction, however, navigational reliability degraded. Warp turbulence increased measurably, and several minor translation incidents were recorded in adjacent routes. These disruptions reduced the system's value as a transit hub. Military assessments conducted after the heresy concluded that Prospero offered no defensible advantage in its ruined state. The planet lacked remaining infrastructure capable of supporting garrison forces, and reconstruction costs exceeded projected benefits. Its orbiting debris fields posed hazards to sustained fleet presence, further diminishing strategic appeal. Administratum strategic analysts concurred with Mechanicus' findings. Prospero's former value had been contextual rather than material. It served as a nexus of knowledge and coordination rather than production or defense. Once that role was eliminated, no residual function justified continued investment. As such, strategic designation was downgraded permanently. Comparative analyses within Administratum archives placed Prospero alongside other worlds lost during the heresy that were not reclaimed. In these cases, the determining factor was not severity of destruction, but absence of exploitable advantage. Prospero consistently ranked low across all material metrics, reinforcing its classification as strategically irrelevant. One internal review raised the question of symbolic value, noting Prospero's association with a traitor legion and its destruction by loyalist forces. This angle was dismissed as non-actionable. Symbolism was considered insufficient grounds for resource allocation, without accompanying economic or military benefit. The cumulative analytical conclusion reached by both institutions was unequivocal. Prospero did not merit recovery, redevelopment, or continued observation beyond hazard monitoring. Its unstable geology, lack of strategic resources, and diminished navigational reliability rendered it a net liability. As a result, Prospero's strategic profile was finalized as null. It existed only as a cautionary datum within broader Imperial analytics, referenced in models assessing planetary vulnerability and post-conflict degradation. The planet's prior prominence did not translate into lasting strategic significance. This reduction from influential world to statistical footnote exemplified the Imperium's utilitarian calculus. Prospero was measured, evaluated, and ultimately dismissed. What remained of interest lay not in its soil or orbit, but in the unresolved questions surrounding what had once made it matter. In the cycles following Prospero's strategic downgrading, both the Adeptus Administratum and the Adeptus Mechanicus conducted final evaluative reviews intended to determine whether any residual value could be extracted from the planet's remains. These reviews were framed not as recovery initiatives, but as confirmation exercises, designed to ensure that no exploitable resource or research opportunity had been overlooked during earlier assessments. Administratum-led inquiries approached the matter through predictive modelling and resource forecasting. Simulations accounted for hypothetical reclamation scenarios, including partial resettlement, controlled strip mining, and conversion into a monitoring outpost. In each case, projected expenditures outweighed potential returns by significant margins. Transport costs alone exceeded expected yields, particularly given the planet's degraded warp accessibility and unstable surface conditions. From a strictly material perspective, Prospero offered little incentive. Mineral deposits identified in previous surveys remained unchanged in classification. Extraction would require extensive stabilization efforts, specialized equipment, and long-term personnel deployment in a hazardous environment. Comparable resources could be obtained more efficiently from compliant worlds without residual contamination or political sensitivity. The possibility of scientific value received more nuanced consideration, particularly from Mechanicus research divisions. Prospero's pre-destruction equilibrium, characterized by environmental stability and efficient integration of technology, represented a data point of interest. Several Magi proposed limited research initiatives focused on understanding how such balance had been achieved and maintained over millennia. These proposals emphasized observational study rather than active experimentation. Suggested benefits included improved urban planning algorithms, optimized energy distribution models, and insights into long-term ecological stability. However, implementation was hindered by the loss of intact reference systems. With cities destroyed and ecosystems disrupted, Prospero no longer presented the conditions that had originally made it noteworthy. Another avenue of inquiry concerned the planet's apparent facilitation of high-volume data exchange and cognitive productivity prior to its fall. Surviving cogitator fragments suggested unusually low error rates in complex information processing. Mechanicus analysts debated whether this was attributable to cultural practices, architectural design, subsurface mineral structures, or factors not readily quantifiable. Without intact systems to study, conclusions remained speculative. Research into warp-adjacent phenomena was explicitly curtailed. While some Mechanicus data hinted at correlations between Prospero's geological features and psychic activity, these findings fell outside sanctioned parameters. Administratum directives prohibited further exploration in this area, citing compliance risk and jurisdictional overlap with the Inquisition. Relevant datasets were sealed or transferred under restricted clearance. Administratum final analyses framed Prospero as a net negative research environment. Any scientific insight gained would be offset by political risk, resource drain, and potential doctrinal complications. The planet's association with the Thousand Suns further discouraged renewed attention. Institutional memory favoured avoidance over re-engagement. The Mechanicus, while more reserved in its conclusions, ultimately concurred. Internal logic engines ranked Prospero low across all priority indices once contamination, instability, and restricted access were factored in. Theoretical value did not justify practical investment. Knowledge that could not be reproduced, tested, or scaled elsewhere was deemed inefficient. Joint review summaries between the two institutions reflect a shared emphasis on closure. Language within these documents underscores finality, employing terms that indicate permanent resolution rather than temporary suspension. Prospero was categorized as an exhausted subject, unsuitable for further study under prevailing Imperial conditions. Notably absent from these analyses is any sustained consideration of the planet's lost intellectual culture as a recoverable asset. Civilian scholarship, non-standard pedagogical models, and pre-imperial knowledge systems were not evaluated independently of their physical infrastructure. Once detached from utility, they ceased to exist within formal assessment frameworks. The final administratum classification assigned to Prospero designated it as a restricted ruin world with no scheduled review. Monitoring responsibilities were limited to navigational hazard warnings and anomaly alerts. No department retained active custodianship beyond archival maintenance. From the perspective of Imperial governance, this outcome represented efficiency. A complex problem had been reduced to a stable administrative state. Uncertainty was eliminated through exclusion rather than resolution. Prospero no longer demanded resources, debate, or oversight. The Adeptus Mechanicus recorded a comparable conclusion. The planet was logged as an instructive failure case, referenced occasionally in analytical models but never revisited directly. Its data lived on only in abstraction, stripped of origin and consequence. Together, these final analyses solidified Prospero's status as an irrecoverable loss, not because nothing of value had existed, but because nothing remaining could be leveraged. The Imperium did not forget Prospero, it finished with it. With this determination, Chapter 2 closes its examination of how Imperial institutions processed the destruction of Prospero. What follows in subsequent archives lies beyond administrative logic and mechanistic assessment, entering domains where containment replaces evaluation and where unanswered questions are not dismissed, but suppressed. In contrast to administratum finality and mechanicus abstraction, inquisitorial engagement with Prospero did not begin with closure. It began with hesitation. The earliest Inquisition records concerning the planet appear fragmented, delayed, and unevenly distributed across Ordo archives. This irregularity was not the result of negligence, but of jurisdictional caution. Prospero fell at the intersection of multiple inquisitorial concerns, and no single Ordo asserted immediate primacy. Initial impressions were shaped by absence rather than presence. Surveyors attached to inquisitorial task groups noted that Prospero exhibited fewer residual signatures than expected for a world destroyed under such extreme conditions. Warp echoes were detectable but inconsistent. Psychic afterimages appeared and dissipated without pattern. Unlike other heresy-scarred worlds, Prospero did not broadcast a continuous psychic scar. Instead, it presented silence punctuated by localized anomalies. Inquisition observers described this silence as operationally problematic. Detection protocols relied on persistence and repetition. Prospero offered neither. Auspex sweeps would return clean results over entire hemispheres, only for subsequent passes to reveal isolated distortions where none had been recorded before. These inconsistencies could not be correlated to orbital position, stellar radiation, or known warp phenomena. Surface investigations, when authorized, were limited in scope and duration. Inquisitorial teams deployed with strict containment parameters, often operating independently of administratum or mechanicus oversight. Reports from these missions emphasized sensory dissonance. Investigators noted that environmental readings frequently conflicted with subjective perception. Temperature registers remained within expected tolerances, yet personnel reported sudden chills or pressure changes without corresponding data confirmation. Visual observations recorded similar discrepancies. Ruined cityscapes, particularly within the remains of Tizca, appeared structurally stable from a distance. Upon closer inspection, buildings exhibited spatial irregularities inconsistent with conventional collapse mechanics. Corridors extended beyond mapped dimensions. Stairways terminated at intact walls. Open plazas measured differently depending on approach vector. These findings were logged without interpretation, as mandated by inquisitorial protocol. One recurring observation across multiple missions was the persistence of intact interior spaces within otherwise devastated structures. Certain chambers remained free of ash, debris, and environmental degradation. Air samples from these locations matched pre-destruction atmospheric profiles rather than the planet's current conditions. No functional life support systems were detected, and yet environmental equilibrium persisted locally. Psychic operatives assigned to Prospero reported heightened resistance when attempting controlled perception scans. Unlike conventional warp-tainted zones, which exert pressure or distortion, Prospero appeared to deflect scrutiny. Attempts to focus on specific locations resulted in sensory overload elsewhere. These effects were not classified as hostile but as obstructive. Inquisition analysts debated whether this resistance represented an active phenomenon or a residual byproduct of the planet's prior function. No consensus was reached. Notably, the planet did not exhibit the malignant characteristics associated with demon worlds or corruption nexuses. There were no recorded manifestations, incursions, or possession events linked directly to Prospero's remains. Several sealed reports referenced the presence of what were termed memory voids. These were areas where both psychic and material records failed simultaneously. Data slates brought into proximity suffered spontaneous corruption, limited to entries referencing specific pre-destruction events. These failures did not propagate beyond targeted content, suggesting selective degradation rather than random malfunction. Recovered pict feeds present further complications. Visual records taken from identical locations at different times showed discrepancies in layout and damage patterns without evidence of intervening activity. Some structures appeared more intact in later recordings than in earlier ones. These anomalies were not attributed to reconstruction, natural movement, or sensor error with confidence. The Inquisition also noted the unusual absence of residual civilian psychic imprints. Worlds destroyed with comparable population densities typically retain echo patterns reflecting mass trauma. Prospero did not. Analysts proposed several explanations, including rapid annihilation, environmental dissipation, or pre-existing suppression mechanisms. None could be substantiated. A minority of observers suggested that Prospero's long-standing cultural discipline regarding psychic study may have influenced post-destruction conditions. This theory posited that structured control rather than suppression could alter how psychic residues manifest. The proposal was logged as speculative and archived without follow-up. Jurisdictional correspondence reveals internal disagreement over classification. Some inquisitors argued for designation as a latent anomaly world requiring continuous monitoring. Others contended that the planet's irregularities did not meet established thresholds for active threat. Ultimately, a compromise designation was applied, mandating intermittent observation without permanent inquisitorial presence. Notably, several Ordo Malleus representatives declined direct involvement, citing insufficient evidence of demonic activity. Ordo Hereticus records, meanwhile, focused narrowly on doctrinal implications rather than environmental phenomena. Ordo Xenos involvement was minimal, limited to exclusionary confirmation of non-Xenos origin. One consistent conclusion emerges across all inquisitorial documentation. Prospero resisted categorization. It could not be cleanly classified as corrupted, cleansed, dormant, or inert. Its anomalies did not escalate, replicate, or conform to known patterns. This ambiguity rendered it unsuitable for decisive action. The final impressions recorded during this phase emphasize restraint. Inquisition analysts warned against provoking unknown responses through invasive study or attempted reclamation. The planet's silence was interpreted not as absence of activity, but as lack of disclosure. By the end of initial inquisitorial review, Prospero was regarded as a world best left undisturbed, not because it posed a clear danger, but because its behaviour suggested incomplete resolution. Whatever processes had once defined Prospero had not concluded cleanly. They had stopped. This assessment marked the beginning of Prospero's existence within Inquisition archives as an unresolved site. It was neither condemned nor absolved. Observation replaced intervention. Questions were catalogued rather than answered. With this shift, Prospero passed beyond administrative logic and mechanistic evaluation. It entered a different ledger, one governed by uncertainty, discretion, and controlled ignorance. The records that follow do not seek to explain what Prospero was. They document only what could not be dismissed. Following the initial phase of observation, limited authorization was granted for the recovery and examination of select artifacts from Prospero's surface. These efforts were conducted under inquisitorial oversight, with strict compartmentalization enforced across all participating bodies. The objective was not preservation in the cultural sense, but assessment of residual risk and informational contamination. Artifacts recovered from Prospero were notable less for their quantity than for their condition. Many objects located within the ruins of former academies and libraries remained physically intact despite surrounding devastation. Data slates, crystalline memory matrices, and archival cogitators were often discovered sealed within structural voids that had escaped collapse. In several cases, these voids appeared deliberately isolated from the rest of the building, though no conclusive evidence of intentional preservation protocols was identified. Initial examinations revealed that much of the recovered material was inert. Data storage units powered on successfully, but contained either fragmentary information or complete absences where extensive records should have existed. These gaps were not consistent with data decay or mechanical failure. Instead, entire subject domains were missing, while peripheral annotations and metadata remained intact. Inquisition analysts identified a recurring pattern. Technical schematics, historical timelines, and administrative records showed higher survival rates than philosophical treatises, metaphysical research notes, or advanced theoretical work. Where advanced material did persist, it was often encoded in non-standard symbolic frameworks that resisted direct translation. Several recovered artifacts displayed adaptive data behavior. When accessed by different personnel, output varied subtly in structure or emphasis, though core informational content remained broadly consistent. These variations were initially attributed to interface interpretation errors. Further testing, however, suggested that the artifacts responded to the cognitive input of the user rather than fixed query parameters. Such findings triggered immediate censorship protocols. Access to adaptive or non-deterministic artifacts was restricted to personnel with specialized clearance. In several documented instances, Objects were removed from study entirely following preliminary interaction, their contents sealed without comprehensive analysis. The stated rationale emphasized precaution over understanding. Beyond data artifacts, material objects also drew inquisitorial scrutiny. Architectural components incorporating crystalline lattices were extracted from beneath key ruin sites. These structures exhibited properties consistent with enhanced resonance and signal amplification. While similar materials existed within the Imperium, the configuration observed on Prospero was atypical. Replication attempts conducted elsewhere failed to achieve comparable stability. Weapons, armor, and conventional military equipment recovered from the planet yielded little of interest. Legion-grade technology followed known patterns and was either destroyed or transferred to Mechanicus custody. It was the non-martial artifacts, particularly those associated with education and cognition, that generated the highest level of concern. The censorship process itself was iterative rather than singular. Knowledge recovered from Prospero was reviewed repeatedly as clearance levels shifted and institutional priorities changed. Information deemed acceptable at one stage was later reclassified as restricted following cross-analysis with unrelated inquisitorial cases. This retroactive tightening of access resulted in fragmented understanding even among senior personnel. Several internal memoranda reference knowledge deemed contextually dangerous rather than intrinsically forbidden. This category applied to material that did not violate Imperial law directly, but risked reframing established doctrine if widely disseminated. Prospero-derived theories on cognition, perception, and structured psychic discipline were frequently cited under this classification. In some cases, censorship extended beyond suppression to deliberate alteration. Portions of recovered data were edited or abstracted before being entered into official archives. Original context was removed, replaced with generalized summaries stripped of origin markers. This process preserved functional utility while erasing traceability. A small number of artifacts were designated for permanent sequestration. Their existence is acknowledged only through reference codes, with no descriptive metadata available outside sealed vaults. The criteria for this designation are not fully documented, though cross-referencing suggests a correlation with items exhibiting autonomous data behavior or resistance to standard analytical methods. The cumulative effect of these measures was informational thinning. Prospero's intellectual legacy, already fractured by physical destruction, was further reduced through selective erasure. What survived did so not as a coherent body of knowledge, but as isolated fragments dispersed across unrelated archives. Inquisition records do not present this outcome as failure. Rather, it is framed as successful risk mitigation. Knowledge that could not be safely contextualized was neutralized through isolation or removal. The absence of incidents linked to Prospero-derived material is cited as validation of this approach. Yet within restricted correspondence, several inquisitors acknowledged a persistent uncertainty. The possibility remained that censorship had obscured not only potential threats, but explanatory frameworks that might have rendered Prospero's anomalies comprehensible. This concern was noted but deprioritized. By the conclusion of artifact recovery operations, Prospero's remaining knowledge existed only under controlled conditions. Its influence was diluted, its scope narrowed, and its origins anonymized. The planet's contributions to Imperial understanding were reduced to what could be safely absorbed without destabilizing prevailing structures. In this form, Prospero ceased to function as a source of insight. It became a cautionary reservoir, tapped sparingly and without attribution. The Inquisition did not destroy all that was found. It ensured that what remained could never fully explain itself. The recovered pict feeds attributed to Prospero originate from multiple temporal strata, most of them fragmented, degraded, or partially overwritten by warp interference. The earliest usable material appears to have been recorded during the final years of the Great Crusade, shortly before the arrival of the 6th Legion. These pict records are not continuous footage, but rather isolated visual captures, often accompanied by Auspex data and incomplete Vox annotations. The Inquisition notes that many of these recordings display spatial inconsistencies. including horizon curvature anomalies, light source displacement, and moments where architectural structures appear to shift position between frames without any detectable seismic or mechanical cause. Several picked feeds focus on the city of Tizca, captured from elevated survey platforms or orbital observation lenses. The city's geometric precision is evident even through corruption and data loss. Towers are arranged according to symmetrical patterns that do not conform to standard Imperial urban planning metrics. In multiple frames, the towers appear to cast shadows inconsistent with the position of the sun at the recorded time. In at least 2 instances, the shadows fall inward toward the base of the structures rather than outward, a phenomenon flagged by Ordo Hereticus analysts as spatial inversion rather than optical distortion. Later picked material, believed to originate from the opening stages of the burning of Prospero, shows rapid environmental destabilization. Atmospheric readings embedded within the footage indicate sudden pressure drops, followed by spikes in particulate density. Ash, vaporized stone, and ionized dust saturate the air, reducing visibility to near zero within minutes. The picked feeds record streets and plazas devoid of civilian movement, suggesting that the population had either evacuated, taken shelter, or been removed prior to the heaviest bombardment. No mass panic behavior is visible in the available footage, which some inquisitorial commentators interpret as evidence of preemptive population control measures enacted by the planet's ruling authority. A small subset of picked feeds originates from ground-level devices, likely worn or carried by human auxilia or remembrancer personnel. These recordings are more unstable and contain frequent signal dropouts. One such feed shows a wide avenue lined with crystalline pylons, their surfaces etched with symbols that resist machine recognition. Attempts to enhance or translate these markings have consistently failed. The symbols appear to change configuration when viewed frame by frame, even when the recording device remains stationary. The Order Malleus has classified these symbols as cognitively hazardous, and further analysis has been restricted. Eyewitness testimonials recovered by the Inquisition are similarly fragmented and uneven in reliability. Many were extracted post-event from survivors, relocated to other Imperial worlds, or from data looms seized during later compliance actions. A recurring pattern across these accounts is the description of Prospero as a world that felt orderly and calm on the surface, yet perpetually unstable beneath that calm. Witnesses frequently report a persistent sensation of being observed, even in uninhabited areas. This sensation is described not as fear-inducing, but as analytical, as though an unseen intelligence was assessing rather than threatening. Several civilian witnesses describe the cities of Prospero as unusually quiet for their size. Ambient sound levels were reportedly low, with little industrial noise or mechanical clamour. One testimony refers to the absence of echo, even in large enclosed spaces, suggesting sound-dampening properties within the city's construction materials. Another account mentions that spoken words seem to carry further than expected without raising volume, a detail that has led some inquisitorial analysts to suspect deliberate acoustic engineering tied to psychic amplification or suppression. Accounts attributed to Imperial personnel present during the burning of Prospero offer a stark contrast. These witnesses describe a rapid transition from controlled military engagement to widespread environmental collapse. Several Space Wolves legionary testimonies reference sudden shifts in terrain, where solid ground fractured into glass-like shards or collapsed into sinkholes without warning. While these accounts are considered biased due to Legion affiliation, cross-referencing with Mechanicum seismic data supports the claim that Prospero's crust experienced abnormal stress patterns during the conflict. One particularly notable eyewitness account comes from a junior astropath stationed in orbit during the opening bombardment. The individual reports a momentary loss of psychic orientation, followed by an overwhelming impression of layered voices speaking simultaneously. The astropath was unable to identify words or intent, but described the experience as structured rather than chaotic. Medical examinations conducted later found no permanent damage, yet the subject retained recurring dreams of a city reforming itself from ash and light. The Inquisition has classified this testimony as inconclusive but anomalous. Additional testimonies reference entities or phenomena not visible on picked feeds. Several witnesses speak of fleeting shapes at the edge of vision, often described as silhouettes without depth or detail. These shapes are consistently reported near libraries, academies, or sites associated with scholarly activity. No direct evidence confirms the physical presence of such entities, and the Inquisition has recorded these observations under the category of stress-induced perceptual artifacts, while noting their remarkable consistency across unrelated witnesses. As the conflict progressed, picked feeds become increasingly distorted. Later recordings show large-scale energy discharges that cannot be definitively attributed to conventional weaponry. In some frames, entire sections of the city appear to dissolve rather than collapse, leaving behind smooth, featureless surfaces where structures once stood. Auspex overlays fail to register debris fields consistent with the apparent destruction, leading to speculation that matter was displaced rather than destroyed. This interpretation remains unconfirmed and is treated with caution. Post-conflict picked material is extremely limited. The few surviving orbital scans depict a planet's surface marked by scorched regions and tectonic scars, yet lacking the widespread radioactive signatures typically associated with exterminatus-level actions. This absence has fueled ongoing debate within the Inquisition regarding the true scale and intent of the destruction. Some argue that Prospero was deliberately neutralized rather than annihilated, while others suggest that a significant portion of the planet's damage occurred on a non-material level beyond the reach of conventional sensors. In its final assessment, the Inquisition characterizes Prospero as a locus of concentrated knowledge accumulation that exceeded acceptable Imperial parameters. The planet's downfall is framed not solely as a punitive action, but as a containment event necessitated by factors that remain only partially understood. While overt heresy is cited in official summaries, internal annotations repeatedly reference uncertainty, incomplete data, and the presence of forces that resisted full documentation. The Inquisition's concluding perspective emphasizes that Prospero's true danger lay not in its armies or defenses, but in its potential. The convergence of psychic aptitude, scholarly infrastructure, and non-standard environmental conditions created a system capable of generating outcomes beyond Imperial prediction models. That potential, once disrupted, did not vanish cleanly. Residual anomalies continue to surface in data recovered from the system, suggesting that Prospero's influence persists despite its physical ruin. Accordingly, the planet remains listed within Inquisition archives not as a closed case but as a reference point. Prospero is cited in multiple internal briefings as an example of a world where knowledge advanced faster than control and where compliance mechanisms failed to account for non-linear escalation. Final annotations stress vigilance rather than closure, noting that while Prospero as a functioning world no longer exists, the conditions that allowed it to arise are neither unique nor eradicated. The Inquisition's final thought on Prospero is therefore deliberately restrained. The planet is recorded as destroyed, its cities reduced and its population scattered or eliminated. Yet the archives refrain from declaring the matter resolved. Instead, Prospero is preserved within sealed records as a cautionary datum, a reminder that the most dangerous worlds are not always those that openly defy the Imperium, but those that quietly evolve beyond its capacity to fully observe or comprehend.